Well, hello everyone. My name is Youssef Hashash, and we will start in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the GEER webinar series and today's presentation on the Port of Beirut explosion, which is a joint Lebanon-US reconnaissance effort. Also with me today, our co-presenters, Salah Sadek, Mayassa Dabaghi, Paolo Zimmaro, and Jonathan Stewart. This is our agenda today. I'll give you have an introduction and give you a background on the event. Then Professor Salah Sadek will discuss the damage at the port of Beirut. Then Professor Mayassa Dabaghi will discuss the building damage survey, followed by Professor Paolo Zimmaro's presentation on damage classification and comparison to damage proxy maps and remote sensing. And then Professor Stewart will provide us with a summary and discussion about ongoing work. The seminar will then be followed by a 35-minute question and answer session. Feel free to type in your questions in the little chat box, and we will be monitoring that, and we will do our best to respond to these questions today. Let's start with the event. A fire started in the port of Beirut. Many people were watching and filming it. And the fire continued, and you would start seeing some flashes in the background. This was attributed to fireworks that were stored. And the fire continued. You continue to see the fireworks in the background and within the smoke, and then the massive explosion ensues. This is a reduced speed of the same video. It gives you a sense of the scale and the enormity of this event. This is a video from another angle. The explosion was that of ammonium nitrate in Hangar 12 at the port of Beirut. The impact of it impacted not only the entire city of Beirut, it was felt as far as Cyprus. Immediately after the event, a number of reconnaissance efforts ensued to catalog the damage for a range of purposes, and the local reconnaissance responses were by the order of engineers and architects in Lebanon, the DAR group, AUB faculty and students, and the AUB urban lab. This particular explosion is one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in history. It gives you a scale. It's number 6 in this table that you're looking at, and it is an equivalent power of about half a kiloton of TNT. So it was massive in a major urban area, a major metropolitan area, and the damage was extensive throughout. GEER, as part of its activities, formed a response, and in mid-August chose to form a team, document the engineering impacts of the explosion. There were 2 principal targets for the team effort. The near-field impact of the explosion of the port of Beirut infrastructure, the immediate area, and then the impact on buildings in Beirut to look at the damage associated with the explosion. A report was published on February 4th, 2021, and it is available on the GEER website. And all the data associated with our report has been published on Design Safe March 11, 2021, and it is publicly available. What were the unique aspects of this GEER team deployment? Lebanon was going through a severe, and continues to go through a severe economic and political crisis. This was compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. There were major travel and mobility restrictions in US and in Lebanon. And because of that, we formed a hybrid multi-country virtual and in-person team, which is made out of personnel from Lebanon, Italy, and the US. We encountered significant in-country deployment delays. We were wanting to send equipment and personnel from the US to Lebanon, but we encountered many difficulties, and instead we had to replace high-resolution imaging tools with consumer-grade imaging tools. I'm showing here, for example, a GoPro Fusion for 360-degree imaging. While we encountered all of these difficulties, this particular team deployment really represents a template for potential future global GEER deployments, whereby we'd have partnership and engagement with in-country colleagues. And overall, we considered it, under the circumstances, a success. Many, many people contributed to this effort, not only those who are presenting here, but many individuals from AUB, Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech, students at UCLA, students at Illinois, and we have collaborators from the additional collaborators from the American University of Beirut. Also, you will see some of 3D scan imagery from engineer Emmanuel Durand, St. Joseph University in Beirut, the Order of Engineers and Architects, and hydrographic surveys from the Lebanese Navy. So without all these enormous efforts, we would not have been able to collect the information that we are sharing with you today. History of the Port of Beirut. The Port of Beirut has been mentioned since the 15th century BC in the mutual letters of the Pharaohs and the Phoenicians. In the Umayyad era, it's the center of the first Arabic fleet. And the construction of the modern port began in the 19th century under the Ottomans, and it extends to the present. These are some images of the port constructions, and we'll get more details about the port construction in the follow-on presentation. This is an image of the area where these are the silos, and the blast was in this area, and showing you the old shoreline. This whole area that you're looking at is part of the port of Beirut. The grain silos, which are quite visible when you look at images of the port damage, these were built in initial phase in 1960s. It was a staged construction, and they have pile foundations about 12 to 15 meters deep. And now at this point, we're going to transition to the impacts of the Port of Beirut. And our first speaker would be Professor Salah Sadek.
The story of the Beirut blast of August 2020 is really a story that begins at the port of Beirut. The port of Beirut is one of the oldest ports along the Mediterranean, in particular the Eastern Mediterranean, and the earliest mention of the presence of a port in the city of Beirut dates back to the 15th century before Christ. The modern incarnation of the port began somewhere around the mid to end of the 19th century, and the growth of the port, as you can see, has been significant over the past 150 years. Most, if not all, the growth has happened through reclamation, with reclamation depth reaching around 20 meters at their deepest, around a kilometer away from the old shoreline, to about 12 to 15 meters in the area of interest, 500 meters or so from the original. These are pictures from 1876 that show the reclamation works that really were the initial large-scale earthworks that were conducted in order to expand the port of Beirut. And you can see here the quay walls were made out of, or the barriers were made out of concrete blocks that are aligned here, floated, and positioned to form the barriers behind which the reclamation works would be completed. By 2020, the port had grown significantly. It had evolved from the original area that we were looking at, which was Basin 1, which is now outside the commercial port area, and it's a naval base. And what is in the red, within the red line, is the port itself. It had a number of, again, expansion periods, the most recent of which were the container terminal expansions. The overall port area at the end of this expansion period was 1.2 square kilometers with water basin areas of about 1 square kilometer. The area of interest that really is the iconic part of the port blast and discussion is this zone here. These are the silos, and this is the Hangar 12 where the explosion ground zero is, or the epicenter lies. What you see here is a series of before and after pictures that are overlapped, just to show you the original situation and then the exact level of damage to the port facility. You can see all the storage facilities are completely decimated. There's very little left. These are the silos. And this is the crater that was left by this horrific event. This is the area facing the blast. You can see a cruise ship that was blown on its side. Again, nothing left of the hangars that were on the other side of this blast. Here we see the silos themselves, just nearing completion of phase 2 of their construction. This portion of the silos, this is phase 1, and phase 2 are these second set of silos. In this first phase, we have a row of 8 silos, and this is times 3 into the picture, whereas here we have 6, and then again times 3, a central row of 6, and then 1 outer, 1 inner. What you see on top of the silos here are the mechanical rooms and the protection for all the equipment, and this is a concrete structure that housed the offices and all sorts of support facilities. What we see in this slide is a top view or a schematic plan of the silos facilities and the phases of execution, where we see phase 1, phase 2, and a third phase that was completed in the mid to late 90s as part of an expansion that happened after the war. The joints that separate, the expansion joints that separate these phases are clear as well in this picture. We expanded significant effort in trying to obtain subsurface data that reflects the conditions of the soil beneath the silos. And after much effort, we were able to locate a young engineer at the time, a young engineer 50 years ago, who had kept to himself a couple of boreholes, the data from 2 boreholes, borehole 7 and borehole 8, which are shown on this plan. And we're plotting here the corrected SPT data versus elevation for these 2 boreholes. The information that we obtained actually confirmed the significant thickness of fill. We're talking about 15 meters roughly in places, relatively loose, placed as is with no treatment subsequent to placement. Because of the nature of the subsurface, the original designers had intended and actually executed a foundation system that was based on driven precast concrete piles, 12 to 15 meters deep. And so we can see them here being driven. They had all sorts of problems driving these piles according to the records that we were able to find. In some cases, they had to pre-drill, pre-jet using water under high pressure in order to allow these piles to be driven in place. They succeeded, and I think this again helped, as we will see later on, in terms of the performance of these silos. Attempts at surveying and assessing the damage in the port in the hours and days following the blast were not easy. The port itself was a crime investigation scene and a rescue scene, and access to it was not possible except for several days, a couple of weeks after the event. The initial surveys that were conducted included drone surveys, and we were lucky enough to be able to do LiDAR or scanning surveys. These were possible through the help of engineer Emmanuel Durand from Aman Engineering, a Swiss company. The following is a product of the merged LiDAR and drone imagery. For orientation purposes, this is the crater or the original location of the hangar in which the blast took place. This first row of cells in the silos have completely been decimated or no longer there. The second row, as you see here, is partially present, and the third row to the back is more or less still standing. What is interesting to note also is the debris on top, which of course creates a risk and hazard to the rescuers and people working underneath, and also the thinness of these shells, these cells that were made out of very thin concrete shells, and the remnants of the grain in the silos that have completely been devastated. This slide summarizes the damage to the silos or the different cells. You will note that the first row here is completely gone, so there's very little left except the base of the cells. The second row, for the most part, suffered severe damage and total destruction. And the third row survived more or less with minor damage. The 6 cells to the south, which were the newest additions, which were empty at the time, completely gone as a result of the blast. We can also see in this picture the joint that separated the 2 phases of construction in the late 60s, early 70s, that show what we're calling the northern block and the southern block of the silos clearly delineated. This is a picture from one of the drones from the top showing the damage to some of these cells. One of the issues that arose for the western row of cells that were undamaged was the fact that they were still filled with grain. And with time, of course, the top structure that was protecting the cells from the elements was completely blown off. So humidity and some rain had occurred at the time, and so fermentation in these cells was starting to occur. And in order to mitigate against that and not have another disaster, emptying these silos was a necessity. Of course, it was like a suicide mission, because how do you approach these silos in their precarious condition and try to empty them? And so this was done basically by drilling holes close to the base of the silos, allowing the grains to flow out. And this is what passes in Beirut at the time for worker protection or conditions of safety during such work. The worker doing the drilling is supported by a makeshift crane, and this dozer here and the bucket is simply there to give the worker protection from the falling debris that was still present and hanging from the sides of the cells and from the top And you can see the grain flowing out. The cores retrieved look something like this for the outer cells. And you can see this is the original concrete. It's about 18 centimeters or so in place, the reinforcement on either side, so two-level reinforcement. And this is the inner jacket that was done from within the silos in the 90s. So this increased thickness that added somewhat to the rigidity of the structure, in addition to the fact that these cells were partially or fully filled with grain, helped a little bit in terms of allowing them to take some of the brunt of the blast. It was noticed that near the top of these silos, particularly the northern cell block, significant movement had occurred away from the blast location towards the west. And that tilting was close to about 30 centimeters near the top with respect to the point at the base. It was decided at the time to try to continuously monitor, or at least periodically monitor, the state of these remaining cells because of the general safety hazard that they pose, and to see the progress of the movement, if any, with time. From the period of September to November, readings did not show any movement of the remaining cells. It is only after severe episodes of rain and actually winter over a few weeks, and readings that were taken in March that are shown in this slide started to show significant changes. And the changes that we can see here are particularly in reference to the northern block. The northern block is the first phase of these silos, whereas the southern block is phase 2. And you can see here in this point cloud and rendered measurements or contoured measurements that the northern block appears to be tilting now. Instead of tilting away from the blast direction, it's now tilting backwards towards the open crater. And this is speculated to have been due to significant erosion and continued soil failure and flow into the crater that occurred particularly after severe rainfalls, and the fact that the foundation of these blocks were significantly compromised. These piles that were slender, the top connections were probably sheared off and no longer presented a stable or dependable base. Whereas for the southern block, movement was not observed, or differential movement between the periods of measurement was not observed. And this is speculated to have been due to the fact that the southern block is further away from the closest position with respect to the open crater. Again, so you can see here the tilt towards the blast direction of around 25 centimeters since November. Now, this observation was also confirmed by looking or identifying cracking that occurred at in these western cells that was not seen in September or November, but actually was clear by the time these readings were taken in March. Moving away now from the discussion of the silos themselves and a little bit more into what happened in the crater region, at the epicenter. This crater that ended up being roughly 110 meters by 90 meters with a depth of around 4 meters below the waterline, so roughly 6 meters of material from the original ground surface were completely lost, for the most part into the basin, into the water. We were able to obtain bathymetry data, and in a rough first estimate of that, and we're getting better quality data as we speak now from the Lebanese Navy. And this data shows, if you look at it, these are the contours that represent the data that was obtained. This line is the original location of the K9, and this is the direction into the basin. And so you can see here that, and this is in 3D, these are the contours represented in 3D. You can see that along the location of the original K-wall, some of the material flowed out into the basin along a slope that is different than the original presumed vertical slope along the K wall. In the process of looking, so this is the initial data that we got from the Lebanese Navy, rough data that allows us to speculate that this is the condition post blast. So initially, this is the K wall. This is the original level to the sediments or to the seafloor, minus 10.5, plus 2.5 roughly here, plus 2.5, and this is the final level as established from the bathymetry data. And what we see here in orange are the zones 2 and 3 which were lost, and here in darker orange or brown, the zones that were deposited. And so there's a flow failure from this zone outwards that we're trying to get a little bit more of a handle on using the newest data available. We can see that this flow extended outwards from the original K wall location about 80 meters, and this is the new contour of the minus 10.5 water depth. And so you can see that this whole area here has been filled with recent sediments, and having the correct or more correct and precise data will allow us to do some back analyses to establish shear strength and soil characteristics that allowed for this to happen as a result of the blast. So this is in short the story of the port of Beirut. I hope I didn't take longer than allowed, probably did. And I will pass on the baton to the next speakers who are going to tell us more about what happened in the city itself.
And our next speaker would be Professor Mayassa Dabaghi, who will tell us about the building damage.
Hello everyone, I'm Mayassa Dabaghi from the American University of Beirut, and I'll be presenting about our efforts to collect data on the impact of the Beirut blast on buildings. I'll start with a brief introduction of the characteristics of the building inventory in Beirut, starting with Beirut's rich architectural history, which includes a number of heritage buildings, such as the ones shown on this slide. These heritage buildings have architectural value or historical value, and some of them were built before the 1900s, and they're scattered all around the city. Now, this table summarizes the evolution of the building stock in Beirut with time, in terms of the typical structural systems, the design and construction quality, and building heights. Structures built before the 1950s and 1960s typically consist of low-rise stone masonry bearing wall buildings that were designed for gravity loads only. And some of the more recent ones also include some reinforced concrete frames. Mid-rise reinforced concrete frame structures emerged in the 1950s, but during the Civil War, which was between 1975 and 1990, the construction was generally of poor quality because of lack of quality control. The last category is that of structures built after the 1990s, which is when seismic provisions were first introduced in building codes. Because in fact, Lebanon is an area of moderate seismicity. So the more recent structures can generally be considered as modern structures, including reinforced concrete frames and walls. And the more recent structures also tend to be taller buildings. Now, most neighborhoods include a heterogeneous mix of all these different building categories, with old heritage buildings adjacent sometimes to modern high-rise structures. In our efforts, we used map resources from the Built Environment database, which is developed and maintained by AUB's Beirut Urban Lab. They provided us with baseline GIS maps, as shown here, for Beirut. These maps include information on the parcels and the buildings in the city, including the location, approximate size, and the date of construction of buildings. Now, our data collection efforts consisted of in-person building inspections, which were conducted shortly after the blast, as well as street view imagery collected later in October. Starting with in-person inspections, the Marwan Samhan Faculty of Engineering and Architecture, or MSFEA at AUB, set up an emergency hotline and engineering dispatch center for Beirut residents and businesses concerned about the structural safety of their buildings after the explosion. And here I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of all the faculty members, staff, and students from MSFEA who participated in this initiative. So as phone calls were received from owners or tenants on the emergency hotline, visits were scheduled with the callers and a team was dispatched. Each of the visits lasted between 15 and 45 minutes, and during the visits, our teams visually assessed the buildings from the exterior and the interior, in part or even in full whenever possible. And the teams took photos of the facades and of structural and non-structural damages that they observed. And at the end of the visit, they provided the owner or tenant with their assessment and with recommendations for possible mitigation measures, such as the need to retrofit or scaffold. I'm now going to show you a short video shot during some of these visits with testimonials from Beirut residents and from our student volunteers.
I would like to see it restored. The government is making it impossible for us to dream about it even because we don't have the means.
They wanted assurance. They wanted us to notify them that they're safe, that their house can be their house one day.
الولاد بنتي عندي بنتي لأنه بيتها راحت ما بينقعد إنه مسؤولية وجوز بنتي كمان بالمستشفى إذا ضفر الولد صار له شيء مسؤوليتي. هلا فضيت الأوضة خفت بس قال لي المهندس بس هلا طمنتوني كتر خيركم. الحمد لله الحمد لله.
Now, during these visits, the teams filled an assessment form based on ATC 20 and ATC 45, but with some modifications to suit the local setting. The survey forms were filled electronically through mobile applications. As you can see, so the survey form is shown on this slide. It includes information about the building location, the areas inspected, some photos of the building facades, for example, information about the number of stories in the building, its primary occupancy, the year it was constructed, its main structural system. The form also includes a general damage assessment, observations of structural hazards such as in walls, columns, roofs, connections, etc. We could even include photos of the observed structural damages. We also input information on any observed non-structural hazards, and finally an overall assessment with a final posting of green, yellow, or red. As I just said, the buildings were initially assigned one of three final postings adapted from ATC 20 and ATC 45. These postings are green or safe, yellow for restricted use, and red for unsafe. And this table shows the description of these postings, which were also conveyed to the owners and tenants. And it was important to note that the red tag does not necessarily mean that the building should be demolished. This was an important point that we wanted to convey to the owners and the tenants, especially for heritage buildings, which we should aim to preserve and rehabilitate. Here you can see the example of one of the heritage buildings that was damaged during the blast. The leftmost picture is that of the building before the blast. The middle picture shows the building after the blast. And thankfully, the building is currently being renovated. So we conducted in-person inspections for a total of 172 buildings between August 7 and September 4. And you can see these buildings in blue on the map. So you can see that they have a large geographic extent, and you can see their location relative to the blast or the ground zero. Now, most of the calls we received were within 2 kilometers from the blast, but some of them, as I just said, were in more distant neighborhoods, but still sustained some damage. I'm also highlighting on the map the location of the AUB campus, which is about 4 kilometers from the explosion. The video that I'm going to show you next shows the impact of the blast on the campus.
And the glass windows all the way to false ceiling and furniture and equipment in some cases.
So damage to campus is mostly non-structural damage, broken glass, blown out doors, damage to false ceilings, damage to the facades. Now, the Beirut Order of Engineers own large-scale field survey, but their inspections were limited to this area here within the red line. These are the areas that are most affected by the blast, and they are mostly within 1.5 kilometers from the explosion. And so this is a zoom in to the buildings, to the area inspected by the Order of Engineers. They inspected a total of about 2,500 buildings between August 12 and August 17, and they had a large number of volunteers helping out with. The OEA, or the Order of Engineers, documented their findings in this final report. In the report, so this is the same figure that I showed before, and then in the report they also present information and maps about the conditions of the buildings that they surveyed, such as no damage or minor damage, observations of cracks, risk of separation in non-structural components, and risk of full or partial collapse. They also paid special attention to heritage buildings. So here, this figure is limited to the heritage buildings in the area, and OEA's assessment of no collapse risk, medium collapse risk, and high collapse risk. And finally, this last figure shows OEA's building specific recommendations, such as the possibility of the need to do immediate structural strengthening, or the need to isolate the building or to evacuate the building. The second type of data we collected are street view 360 degrees photos. And this was done in order to document the effects of the blast for a larger number of structures, although these were provided only information on the exterior of the structure. And we used a GoPro fusion camera that you can see in the photo that was mounted to the roof of a car. And this is the actual setup that was used. And part of the mount that connects the tripod to the roof was actually manufactured in-house. And this map shows the geotagged location of the about 2,100 photos that were taken. All of these images and the related metadata were uploaded to mapillary.com under the username AUBMSFEA, and they can be retrieved from there. Now, this slide shows an example of images from the street view survey, from the 360-degree photos. So this is how a photo would first appear if you view it in a regular image viewer. And then if you, this is how it looks like in the virtual reality viewer. And this video that I'm going to play, basically it shows the full range of angles that these 360 photos provide, and they give you a sense of how they can be used to assign facade damage classes, as will be explained in more detail in the next presentation. And in fact, we were also able to use some of these 360-degree photos to identify some of the more heavily damaged buildings, solely based on photos of the exterior. So this is the example of a partially collapsed building that you could identify from the 360 photos. And that's it for me. Next, my colleague Paolo Zimmaro will talk about how the data we collected was used to assign various damage classes, which were then compared with satellite-based damage proxy maps.
Hello everyone, my name is Paolo Zimmaro. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Calabria in Italy, a visiting researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a GEER member since 2016. I'm going to show you some damage classification information and then a comparison against remote sensing maps, namely damage proxy maps. First of all, I would like to set the stage showing you this damage classification scheme we adopted for reinforced concrete buildings and masonry buildings, going all the way from D0, which means no damage, to D5, which is full structural collapse. Intermediate damage levels are D1 to D4. This damage classification scheme was adapted from Bray and Stewart 2000, and it's been used by many GEER mission deployments, and it's consistent with EMS 98, Gruntal 1998, which is a damage classification scheme widely used in structural engineering. Some examples of this structural damage classification we made are reported here. First of all, I would like to start with an intermediate damage level to a masonry building. This is the D2, where we have most of the damage concentrated in non-structural members. This is a D2 for a reinforced concrete building. Against the same story, structural damage is very low. Most of the damage is on non-structural members. Then we have a slightly higher damage level for reinforced concrete buildings with a zoom-in photo on a beam column node. And then we have a partially collapsed masonry building. Partial collapse is D4, total collapse would have been D5. Here I have a zoom-in area around ground zero of structural damage classification. As you can see here, we're going from D2 all the way to D5 in this area. We have data all the way to 5 kilometers and more from the ground zero area. Here I have some statistics about stone masonry buildings on the left-hand side and reinforced concrete buildings on the right-hand side. These pie charts are showing us that D0 was only 3% for masonry buildings, meaning that a lot of those were damaged by the explosion. Remarkably, we have 15% of the buildings with D4 or D5, which means partial total collapse. On the other hand, we don't have any D4 or D5 for reinforced concrete buildings, meaning no reinforced concrete buildings collapsed. And we have 17% of those with damage level equal to 0. For damage level to reinforced concrete building, D3 is also only 8%. In this slide, I have the top panel with on the y-axis normalized the frequency of buildings, on the x-axis the distance from the blast. This is showing you the total distribution of the buildings we analyzed with respect to the distance from the blast. As you can see, most of them are concentrated in the area that is 2 kilometers from the blast, but we have data all the way to 5 kilometers almost. On the lower panel, I have a very interesting plot On the left-hand side, masonry buildings, right-hand side, reinforced concrete buildings. On the y-axis, I have the damage category. On the x-axis, the distance from the blast. This plot shows us a very pervasive trend of decreasing damage category with increasing distance. Essentially, the damage level decreases as we go further away from the blast, as expected. Remarkably here, again, I'm showing you that D5 and D4 are not present for reinforced concrete building, and we don't have a lot of D0s for masonry buildings. In addition to the structural damage classification, we also did a non-structural classification based on the facades. So this is going to be our facade damage classification scheme that goes from 0, which means no observable effects on windows and doors, all the way to 3, which means complete blowout of windows, doors, and frames. Then we have 2 intermediate levels of damage. 1, which means that some windows are broken and frames are usually intact. We also report the break rate. And then damage level 2, which means some doors and door frames are blown out, and we also report the blowout rate. For every single facade, we also collected data about the azimuth, which means what is the direction to which they are exposed to, which is something that can be important when analyzing the direction from which the blast is coming from. All of the data I'm showing you is present as part of an attachment of the GEER report in a digital format, so you can actually go there and take a look to these files. 2 examples here of damage classification to facades. On the left-hand side, I have 1, damage level 1, which means that no frames were blown out, but there was some damage to windows. Damage level 3, which is the highest, is complete blowout of windows and frames. As you can see there, on the right-hand side of this photo, we have a pretty bad damage to this facade. Here I'm showing you the locations of 360-degree photos that Mayassa just showed you. And then here, with this animation, I have every single facade for which we have a damage based on the classification I showed you. We're talking about more than 9,000 facades that's been assessed, and as you can see here, we have data in all of the directions from ground zero, which is pretty interesting. Now, we compared damage assessment we made to structures and facade with the so-called damage proxy maps that are maps created from satellite radar data published by NASA JPL. Usually these radar are mounted on a satellite. They send radio waves and record the return. This is called the echo. Then 2 or more images that are called the synthetic aperture radar images, SAR images, are taken at the same time but from slightly different angles. And so this is the so-called interferometric pair. Same time, different angles. Interferometric pairs are used to calculate the so-called interferometric coherence, which is a measure of the difference in phase between the 2 images. This is actually a snapshot of the correlation between SAR images, which means how similar 2 interferometric pairs are. Exploiting this information, it's possible to construct the digital elevation model maps, DEMs, which is something that many of us are familiar with. The coherence change between pre-event and post-event interferometric pairs is used to generate damage proxy maps, which are essentially based on a multi-temporal coherence analysis. So we take the coherence of images before the event and the coherence post-event, and then we take the distance. The coherence change is what's used to build these damage proxy maps. In other words, if this is the timeline, we have a satellite acquisition cycle every 8 to 72 hours, depending on the satellites we're looking at. So we can produce these maps in a fairly short time frame. And then we have a disruptive event at a certain point in time, so we can go back and take 2 pre-event images, so we can build the first interferometric pair, and then we have a post-event image. And then we can calculate the pre-event coherence between images 1 and 2 and the post-event coherence between images 1 and 3 and 2 and 3. For this particular event, we have an enhanced damage proxy map, which takes 12 images of pre-event data, establishing a time series which can be thought as a backbone distribution before the blast. And then this is compared with images after the event. Data to create these enhanced damage proxy map are taken from the Sentinel-1 satellites deployed by the European Space Agencies. The 4 satellites that's been used are shown here with the angle of line of sight of the satellites with respect to the port of Beirut, showing a nice coverage of the city. This is the resulting map, which has a damage proxy map number, which is the coherence change going from 0 to 1. 0 means there is no coherence change, so between pre and post, the image stayed the same. 1 means that there was a lot of coherence change, so likely damage. We have colored pixels going from yellow to dark red, where yellow represents a small amount of predicted damage. Dark red is a huge amount of predicted damage. As you can see here, there is an attenuation of predicted damage as we move away from the blast site from ground zero. And this is something that we expected. Here I'm showing you a comparison, a visual comparison between structural damage we assessed, D0 to D5, with respect to damage proxy maps. This map doesn't tell us a lot of information. For this reason, we also prepared the quantitative comparison, which is telling us how this damage proxy map does in terms of prediction of the damage with respect to what we observed on the site. On the y-axis here, I have the structural damage category. On the x-axis, the DPM, damage proxy map numerical index. Every single pixel in the image has an associated numerical index, which is the coherence change, although only pixels where the coherence change is higher than 0.75 are colored, meaning that below that threshold, the damage proxy map numerical index is still there, but it's shown as transparent. As we can see here, yellow means 0.75, dark red means 1, and we have a very nice trend of increasing structural damage as the coherence change on the x-axis goes up. The only out of trend point is D3, for which we don't have a lot of data, so this may be justifiable, but the trend is there and it is persistent. Then we did the same with the 9,000 facade damage we assessed. And as you can see here, we superimposed the facade damage assessment with the damage proxy map. In the ground zero area, I have all of these damage level 3, which is complete blowout of windows and the frames. In bright red, this nicely aligns with the damage proxy map high damage. And then there is a fringe area where we have yellow, orange, intermediate damage levels to facades, and then as we move further away from the explosion, we have no damage level 0, which is green. As you can see here, the damage proxy map seems to capture pretty nicely the bright red, complete blowout of frame damage, and then where we have a lot of dark red damage proxies, and then there is no high values of damage proxies where there is no damage to the facades. So this visual inspection tells us a lot of useful information. However, to have a better analysis of how the damage proxy map does with respect to the observed damage, we did the same exercise I showed you for the structural damage, where I have on the y-axis the facade damage category, on the x-axis the damage proxy map numerical index, which is the coherence change. Again, we have a trend of increasing numerical index of the damage proxy map that corresponds with increasing facade damage category. Again, we have something that is a little out of trend, which is damage to facade number 2. This damage level is not populated with a lot of data points, so this may be justifiable. But again, we have a pretty persistent, pervasive trend of increasing coherence change with increasing facade damage category. And this is something that tells us that the damage proxy map does well for this particular event in terms of predicting facade damage and structural damage, which is a pretty useful piece of information. More details about these analyses are provided in the GEER report. So this was my last slide. I have some contact information here, and I leave to the conclusions of John Stewart. Thank you so much.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Paolo. So I'm John Stewart, and I will be summarizing the work and describing some of the ongoing work and next steps. Go to the next one. Before I go into this slide, I should actually acknowledge that our colleague Salah Sadek has joined us as we've gone through the webinar, so welcome, Salah. So next one, please. So let me take a moment to talk about the origins of this effort and the fit with the GEER mission. So, what we do when we do reconnaissance is to collect perishable data on extreme events with the aim of opening doors for future research. And the hope is that that future research will produce knowledge that reduces vulnerability. Most of the people, I think, attending today, and most of us on this reconnaissance, are earthquake engineers, and so we have a lot of experience in learning from earthquakes. Like all of you, I'm sure, and people worldwide, I was horrified by the news from Beirut on August 4th. But as a GEER person, my mind soon turned to how could we try to learn from this extraordinary event in the same way that we try to learn from earthquakes. After talking to a few people, we felt that this effort would be useful. None of us were blast experts, but we understood that blast loading is a man-made extreme event, and that blast loading does have an important role in the risk portfolio of some urban areas. So this led to contacting people at AUB, who you've heard from, and others in the US that comprise our team, and soon the team that you've heard from today have been assembled. Now, as to the issue of GEER fit, some might question GEER's role in a reconnaissance that has such a strong structural component to it. However, when you're in the moment, in the field of doing reconnaissance, the goal is to collect data. And it doesn't really make sense in that setting to silo ourselves as geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, or anything else, unless you know that specialists different from your own in a particular topic area are engaged and are going to address it. In Beirut, in this circumstance, structural performance was a major issue, and it was really up to this team to tackle that. And so that's what we did, even though we carry the name GEER. Okay, so now about the unusual circumstances. The logistics of working in Beirut were of unprecedented complexity in my experience, both because of COVID-related travel restrictions, but also because of the extremely challenging situation that our Lebanese colleagues found themselves in. Of course, they were dealing with the aftermath of the explosion itself in their own city, but they also were dealing with many other problems, including a currency collapse and some political instability. But we found a way forward. We met regularly, weekly, over an extended period of time, exchanging information, and we were able to develop objectives of this reconnaissance. We defined what the hurdles were, what the problems we faced, which were significant, and we adapted. In short, we did what engineers always do. You troubleshoot, you solve problems, and you find a way. And we think we were able to complete a productive reconnaissance without the traditional travel of a US-based team to the country. And we were able to do this because we had trusted in-country colleagues, and we were able to make productive use of remote sensing information. So we think that this is a model that may prove to be useful in future events for GEER and other EERs as well. I should mention before going to this summary of the gems is that I think this model worked here because we were able to draw upon such strong pre-existing professional contacts with our colleagues in Beirut, which just shows the importance of having that if you're going to do significant work abroad. Now, as to some of the key technical findings, I think some of the gems that will likely be studied in the months and years to come include the foundation performance of the silos. So we know what the foundation was. We know that it tilted away during the explosion, and interestingly, as Professor Sadek described, it is now tilting back towards the blast site. And so, can models produce this type of behavior? I think that'll be a very interesting thing to explore. The next one has to do with the crater. So the blast created this large crater, failed the key wall, and appears to have produced a flow slide of probably liquefied fill out into the harbor. And so there's sort of obvious studies that can be done in connection with that of residual strength. Next one. You can go to the next. So the next one is having to do with the building performance within Beirut. So there is a wealth of information here, both from a structural point of view and also from a facade point of view. The facade part of this was new to this reconnaissance to really document that, because we felt that was an important element if you're talking about blast effects. And obviously the data that Mayassa and Paolo showed, there's a distribution. We didn't really get into that in this presentation, but the details of the damage distribution across the city are crucial to understanding how the blast impact, how the blast pulse traveled through the city. Next one. And then what this is about is the DPM is the damage proxy maps. So we felt that we were able to get some very useful information out of the DPMs. And we really tried to integrate the information from that into our work as we were going along. And there again, we think that that's something that'll probably be part of future reconnaissance missions as well. Okay, so the next slide is our next steps. So as Mayassa explained, there are different sources of information on building performance that we have not integrated into our study as of yet, because we don't have all the details to make the classification. So that's the order of engineers data, for example. Next one. So one of the powerful aspects of this data set is that we have damage proxy maps, which assign a damage level to a specific coordinate. And we can compare that to these levels of performance. Sort of the overall picture was shown in Paolo's slides, but there's a tremendous amount more that can be done there, including the fact that DPMs can actually be taken for any time increment that you like, as long as you have satellite coverage. So you could even use the DPMs, for example, to track recovery over time and see how that does in comparison to what we've actually observed. So next one. So we believe that there could be some pretty detailed case history studies undertaken in the future related to the port. as I mentioned before, the flow slide analysis and the silo foundation performance analysis. And then I think I might have one more. And then, one of the fields that is not our own, but there are plenty of engineers and others, mechanical engineers in many cases, who specialize in this, and that is how does the impact of a blast propagate in space if there's no interference from buildings, and then in the presence of the interference, and can we simulate that blast pulse and how it impacts buildings, both on the face that receives the blast and then also around the sides and in the back. So, this is not my area, but the data we've provided here is going to be useful to those folks. Some of them have already been in touch with us about using it. So that's the end of our next steps, and I think we can probably go to Q&A now.
Great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you to all of my colleagues. If you wouldn't mind to turn on your cameras and your mics, so we can now enter into the panel discussion and answer questions we may have from our colleagues. Just a reminder that you won't be able to ask them in person, but you can type it in the chat box and we can all see it. And so I will go through the first one. The question we have. Okay, this has been an excellent presentation of a great recon effort. I believe this presentation be modified, adapted to emergency response community. For many reasons, space does not permit to detail here. Thanks to all. Thanks, Chuck. I think it's an excellent comment. Yes, we agree with that, and I don't know if someone would like to add to this particular issue or this suggestion. John?
I appreciate the kind remarks from Charlie. I don't have anything to add, really.
Okay, very good. Let's see. Do we have any other? At this point, I don't see any other comments, but maybe, Salah, you wonderful that you were able to join us. So I hope you can you can see us well. And
thank you very much, Youssef. Apologies for missing the first part.
Okay. So
Rick has a question. Maybe we'll go to Rick's question.
Yes, we should go. Okay, Rick's question. Okay, what evidence, if any, did you find of blast-induced liquefaction other than the flow slide discussed? Maybe Salah, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, a quick answer to Rick's question is we could not find any evidence that we can directly point to and say, this is another line. There were some locations along the caves, behind the cave, and there are some pictures in the report itself that show excessive deformation that we could not really attribute to anything other than a weakening of the subsurface fill. The in at least one of them, we have material that is weak enough to potentially liquefy, and given the power of the blast, it is not unlikely that this is what happened. I hope that addresses the question, although not without in absolute terms.
Thank you, Salah. So there is potential for further investigation on this topic. Okay, great. We have another question, and this is from Marika. What other data did you wish you had? Maybe we'll ask Mayassa. Would you like to maybe start with some of your thoughts on this issue?
Hello. Yes, definitely. So the data that you collected on the buildings from the in-building inspections was rather limited. So we only have information on 172 buildings. So hopefully we'll be able to get the more extensive data set from the other entities that also collected extensive observations and damage assessments on more buildings in Beirut, so that we can have a wider coverage, basically. And yeah, the street view survey is also, I guess, maybe additional images can be collected to track recovery. So that could also be something that we could still do, and it would be interesting to do to track the recovery of the city.
Thanks, Mayassa. Any of other panelists would like to suggest? Salah, were you wanting to say something?
I can add to Marika's suggestion for our wishes, if one were to wish, basically. I wish we had data that is subsurface type data on the port itself prior to, but given the history, the way it was, most of the was done in the port, there was little control, and whatever data was there was lost with the people that did the work. Unfortunately, this is part of what we suffer through in Lebanon, maybe other places as well. This memory, this loss of memory doesn't exist. The project is finished and then the data is lost. So that is really one of those areas where I wish that we could do better. That's the way it is.
Great, thank you. John,
if I can just add,
yeah.
If I could just add one thing on the on the field performance data that I wish we had, it would be, I wish we could have gotten into the port complex earlier to look for evidence of liquefaction and things like that. But as I recall from our early conversations, there was not the possibility of getting into the port complex in the weeks after the blast. So.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Go to the next question. It says, just to confirm that the analysis to date did not account for line of sight. Anyone would like? I think at this stage, maybe David, if you can elaborate a little bit more. I'm not sure I'm clear on that. Okay, go ahead.
I think what David is getting at is if you're looking at how damage varies with distance, it would be nice to go a step further and see if the damage is different if you have a direct line of sight from the explosion to a particular building versus if there's something in the way, a tall building between the subject building and the blast. So that is something we're very much targeting to do, but we haven't completed that analysis
yet. Okay. Great. And David is confirming the interpretation. Thank you, John. We have another question from Charlie, it's a tech question. One, any data for missile damage versus overpressure? Maybe I'll start with that one.
I think he's getting there is if I may, there's an investigation underway, and I think all the investigative talent in the world was involved at one point or another, from the FBI to the French to the Italians and and the local, of course, security forces. And we really today don't was involved, but in all likelihood, everything is pointing towards the absence of any external, agent that started the event. It was all initiated in that Hangar 12 on the port. The fires that were initiated by the blast were nothing far away from the epicenter or the ground zero in terms of the fires. And finally, on to the it over the so simply turned over. There was no damage to the hull that would cause it to sink or to take water on the other side. It simply was turned over by probably came from the blast source across that basin and overtopped it and turned it over. And in a similar way, this is what happened to another ship, and I don't know if it was clear in the presentation, that was on the quay perpendicular to the blast location, deposited on the quay itself.
I see. Salah, the next question is from Mustafa Saadi. It's also for you. It's about
Hi,
whether
yeah.
whether there is any ongoing feasibility evaluation for repair versus demolishing and rebuilding of the silos.
There are, thoughts that are being, discussed. The problem in Lebanon, as you know, Mustafa, now is that we have so many priorities that, funny enough or sad enough, tragic enough, this is the least of our priorities, basically, because, we're dealing with, an economic, complete collapse and what have you, and political unrest. But to answer your question, the silos remaining have option. I mean, usually the fact is that they cannot be restored. None of them can. Now, whether to rebuild the same in a different location should be, or at least part of them should be retained for posterity as as a mark of the event. There are also arguments being made in that direction. Part of the silos or all of them should be left to remind us of what we are capable of doing when we're, when we drop the ball on what we're supposed to be doing correctly. So there are studies, but for the most part, the direction is going to be either leave them as is, which I doubt, or complete demolition and rebuilding.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I think would be, Paolo, you may be able to address that. The question is, did the GEER team find that the DPMs worked better for buildings than for slopes following central Italy earthquakes?
The short answer to that question would be yes, but there is, something that should be said about that. We are talking about two different products. The damage proxy map for the Central Italy earthquake was based on only a small amount of pieces of information we had from two satellites. This one is a particular new algorithm that was developed just for this particular event by the NASA JPL team, coordinated by Dr. Yoon. And so in that sense, it allows us to have a better overview of the area with many more satellites all combined and with a pre-event information that is based on 12 images, not just one or two. So it is in that sense kind of like two different versions of the map. And this one that was prepared for the port of Beirut, the last explosion, was much more capable of capturing damage overall. There's something else that should be said, which is my perception, and this is based on some anecdotal analysis. We didn't do a thorough analysis. This is going to be part of an ongoing project funded by NASA, is that damage proxy maps work better in general when there is high building damage, which means that the elevation that the radar waves perceive changes dramatically. When you have a slope, especially when the slope is not very steep or the damage is also subhorizontal, this technology probably does not as well as it does for buildings that are heavily damaged. Although, as I said, this is just something anecdotal because it's not based on a thorough analysis.
Great, thank you. And this is maybe, Salah, you can help us supplement your earlier response. This is from Charlie about what he meant by the missiles. I know there was a theory about an external missile, but he was in fact referring to flying debris. That is, what was...
On this issue, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Flying debris, there was no evidence of any large size debris that was blown, significant distances from the port across into the city to cause, any significant damage. There was evidence, and actually for the first row of old buildings that face the highway, we have a couple of pictures that show, let's say, basketball size or slightly greater pieces of concrete that made it that came from the port and made it into the residences. but nothing really to cause any of this extensive damage that we saw. I hope that addresses the question this time correctly, Charles.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Salah. We have the next question is from Rick, and it is asking why Steer did not investigate. And I'm wondering if John or David would like to address this question.
Is David able to talk, or I'm not sure if it's just panelists who can speak?
I thought he was actually in the amongst the panelists. At least that's how he was listed. David, are you able to speak, or maybe type?
If he is able to speak, I'd like to give him the first crack at this, but if not, I can do it.
Let me check here. David, oh, I don't know. Okay, I don't see the audio on his, John, so maybe you want to try to address this.
Yeah,
if you
in my remarks that were summarizing the effort, I mentioned the origins of this. And I did reach out to, of course, David and also the Steer leadership at that time to see if we could perhaps coordinate an effort in Beirut. In short, there wasn't an interest in mobilizing. I think that there might have been a number of reasons for that. I can't really know exactly why, but there were certainly weather-related extreme events happening in the U.S. at that time that may have been their main focus. But that's just speculation on my part. So, but anyway, once we knew that we were flying solo, so to speak, in terms of EERs, we just went for it.
Okay. Yeah, and David said they were not responding to the international events, and their focus was on weather events in the U.S. So, yeah, thank you, John. The next question is about the performance. It's by Muhammad Arab. It's the performance of piles. Are you planning for any investigation to evaluate the connection and the deformation of the piles after the event?
The answer is it's one of those wishes that we referred to earlier. And if you know the context we're working in, and Youssef is smiling because he knows the context. Access-wise and ability, it's a safety hazard. I mean, the silos themselves are a safety hazard. There are environmental hazards that have been created since because of the grain that is decomposing in open air. And until that debris is removed, until the silos are either demolished or in part or in full, we won't have access to the pile. But once we do, of course, there are many things that you can envisage doing, and we'd love to do that. And we are in contact with the so-called powers that be. At least they know we are interested. And if and that time comes, we'll definitely take the opportunity. It's a unique case study. There have been some analyses done by Monsieur Durand, who's the Swiss expert who helped us with the scanning on lateral movement that may have caused the tops of the piles to shear, but it's still at this point circumstantial and not really, something that we can call, fact or something we can consider as established. But thank you for your question. It's an interesting point.
Well, thank you, Salah. I think at this point, I don't see any more questions on the list. If there are from our attendees, please feel free to add. But also, we're getting towards the end of our time. I'd like to maybe give the panelists some, any last thoughts you would like to share with our audience. And
there are a couple of questions on the Q&A tab.
Oh, you know what? You're right. Sorry, I didn't see these. Oh, thank you, Mayassa. I guess I'm okay. So
some were already answered, but some not yet.
Okay, so we'll start with the first one. This is from Sharb al-Ghanim. It's was there any recordings of radiations near the epicenter? Maybe we'll start with that one. Are you aware of any?
I'm sure there was. Yeah, I'm sure there was, but we're not aware of them. I mean, this is
Okay.
if it has been done, it's not public information. But I would be surprised if it wasn't done, given the nature of the people involved.
The second question, second part of the question is, are there maps for facade damages, but for facades that are completely shaded from the explosion? Sherba is interested in understanding issues related to negative pressure that you would have.
Would you like to answer that, Paolo? We did look into that.
Yeah, I can take a first crack. We do have that data as part of our data set, which includes some 9,000 facades, and this is something we are currently looking at in order for us to understand whether there was that shading effect. We're also looking at something that has to do with the question, which is what was the shading effect of high-rise buildings that are, preceding in the line of sight, buildings that are shorter, and so we are looking into these kind of patterns. I think we don't have a definitive answer on whether this was a strong effect or not in terms of facade damage, but we do have the data. And I should mention that the data is available in the GEER event page. It's all in a digital form. We have shape files that can be downloaded, and the entire data set has a DOI assigned to it, and it's available on designsafe.com.
Second question is also related. Next question related to DPM is: did the field teams use the DPM or any other remote sensing products to inform decision making at all, or only to compare to field data later on?
So the DPM was something we were looking at from the beginning because we did have it when we started, and I think it informed us to the extent that it gave us a sense for the breadth of the city that we needed to be looking at for things like the different survey, particularly the mapillary type survey. Of course, we had on the ground knowledge of these distributions as well, but in general, that's how DPM is used. It kind of gives you a sense for the breadth of where you need to conduct your study.
But there was no on-the-ground use of it for decision-making, right? In terms of maybe...
No, more of our planning as a...
Right.
As we were meeting, yeah.
We have another question from Charlie, is why is wet grain such a problem?
Well, if I'm, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I heard from experts, basically, is that when they are confined, when it is confined in a space that is a closed silo and the grains are fermented, the byproducts are, gases that are flammable or explosive, and they could generate, secondary explosions that may be quite significant. And on the outside, it's, there are all sorts of, when the grain is outside, there are all sorts of fungi that may become airborne, and they are toxic to humans. So in either case, it's not a good thing. That's what I was told. Exactly.
I see. Well, thank you, Salah. We have a question from Hiba Jalloul, and the question is: I'm wondering if GEER also assessed the debris generated by the blast and how it is to be managed in addition to the structural and geotechnical assessments done.
Can I take a quick stab at that? Thank you very much, Hiba, for the question. It's an interesting one, given the fact that today it's yet another controversial issue that we are facing. What happens to the debris that is unclaimed or unuseful debris? Useful debris has already been, taken by people who are interested. Let's say glass has been recycled, steel or whatever is being sold as scrap. But there is a mix of debris that has no parent, and it's being dumped in open spaces that are uncontrolled in residential areas. And currently, it is a big question amongst people who are interested to to see what can be done with it, because it cannot be left that way. There is asbestos concerns, there are heavy metal concerns, and so the short answer is the reusable material that was clean enough has already been pushed through the recycling and the reuse road. The rest of the stuff is definitely not usable, and it should be, landfilled or at least taken away from residential location.
Thank you, Salah. And David was indicated to us that NSF recently funded a new EER called GEER, whose focus is debris quantification. So that is something to consider
now
in
you
the
tell
future. Now we tell you, indeed. Excellent. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Just want to make sure, any last minute thoughts from the panelists before we wrap up?
Just want to thank NSF, as always, for supporting GEER. And
also one thought.
And I want to thank our colleagues at American University of Beirut, especially because, of course, none of this happens without them. And so their work was outstanding throughout.
Salah?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to echo John's sentiments. I think this was an opportunity to renew friendships that we had already and build trust and professional activity on top of the layer of the fact that we knew each other, and that was really something that worked out beautifully. The persistence and the seriousness with which every member on the team followed through. This was, as you realize, not an easy path or not an easy trip to go through, but it was really very rewarding. And I want to add one item that is maybe not spoken about a lot, and that is, I found that this involving ourselves from this side into this activity was therapeutic. I mean, it gave a sense of purpose, because when events like this happen, you are completely taken over by a sense of despair and inability to affect events. And just to do something that has has great benefits, and I think we don't see that enough. We don't talk about that enough. Well, thank you anyway for your attention.
Thank you. Mayassa, Paolo, any last minute thoughts you want to add?
No, thank you, and hoping for continued collaborations. Good.
Yeah, and let me add to what was just said. The work was done under extraordinary circumstances, and just was a tremendous team effort. It was therapeutic for you, Salah, and it was therapeutic for us as well. And at this point, I would also like to thank the audience for attending the seminar and for the great questions you had and the participation. And also thank you to Jennifer for helping us arrange this. Really appreciate it. And keep an eye for the next GEER webinars that we will be showing you in the future. Thanks again, and take care, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.